Hi, I'm Tom Woods, and you're listening to the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to the show that gets Christians thinking about faith and politics. Get ready to challenge the status quo, expand your imagination, and tackle controversy head on. Let's stand together at the intersection of faith and freedom. It's time for the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. I am your host, Doug Stewart, and I have an important special guest with us today. His name is James Whitford, and he is the CEO and founder of True Charity. He's also the co-founder and executive director of the first certified True Charity in Joplin, Missouri, Watered Gardens Gospel Rescue Mission. James earned his doctorate from the University of Kansas Medical Center in physical therapy, after which he worked in the specialty field of wound care before his transition to full-time ministry work. James, thanks for joining us.
Doug, great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, we got connected because you've been a fan of LCI for a little while, and we got to chat recently and got to know your passions, and I'm like, man, I got to have you on because it's a topic we kind of come back to pretty regularly on the show, which is the issue of poverty. And some of my listeners who've listened a long time have known that when I was becoming a libertarian from sort of being more conservative, one of the reasons I didn't become more left-leaning is that I realized through some kind of just in my journey as a libertarian that the state really makes the issue of poverty worse. And it actually really harms the poor in so many ways. Now, obviously, some poor do benefit from state-based programs. I understand that as, not everything in every situation is absolutely terrible. But it was really important to me when I was becoming a libertarian that poor people had what they needed, that poor people could be taken care of. And even above that, for me, it was all about, well, how do we have shalom rather than just, transfer of money and all the things that the left tends to want to do. So this is a really important issue to me. It's near and dear to my heart, this among a couple of other sort of pet issues of mine. And so you and I had a great conversation a little while back over the phone, just the two of us. And I wanted to kind of talk a little bit more and let our listeners hear how a non-state funded, non-state involvement approach to charity and poverty reduction can actually work. So you are my guy to talk to about that. So I want to hear from you, your story, like what got you into it and where things are for you.
Sure. Yeah. Let me give you just a little bit of background. My wife and I co-founded a mission in Southwest Missouri, a very small nonprofit 20 years ago. And compassion really was the driving force, Doug. That was it. I mean, we had a faith and a love for Jesus, and compassion is what really caused us to want to do something, right? To do something to help the poor. And I think that's a very good and a very common thing that God lays on the hearts of his people. And so we began to do something. But the something that we were doing really wasn't affecting the change that we had hoped for. And we learned that pretty quickly in the first few years of being basically kind of like a redistribution center. People would donate things, and then folks who were poor or homeless would come in with various needs, and we would meet the need. But it was really much more of a kind of a handout model ministry. We were praying for people. Again, there was a lot of heart in it, but we just weren't seeing some of the fruit that we had hoped to see. And so we knew that we needed to change our model. We did a few things, but I think, along the way, certainly one big point for us was coming across a book called Toxic Charity. And this book, written by Robert Lupton, takes the reader through 5 steps to dependency. And I think the listeners will really resonate and maybe love to learn these. The first time you give something to someone, they'll have an appreciation for it. The second time you give the same thing to that person, they'll develop an anticipation that you'll do it a third time. A third time, and they'll develop an expectation. And then a fourth time, they'll feel entitled to it. And a fifth time, become dependent on you for it. So appreciation, anticipation, expectation, entitlement, and dependency. And we knew that we'd been guilty of that. So we thought, well, okay, so let's change our model to where we're not just looking at every person coming through the door as a broken human that is in need of charity and charity only, or that they're just good to be the recipient of benevolence and that's about it. So we began to look at people as God would want us to, which are people that are made in his image. And so there is something noble about every person, and there's potential and capacity in every person. There's a gift and a skill in every person. So we began to look at people like that and then welcomed them into partnership and actually developed a model where folks are able to earn things they need. But, to make a long story short, Doug, we really implemented challenge into our charity to help move from cyclic relief, where people become dependent on relief and aid, and instead help them move, into development. So from relief to development. But it does require work. It requires challenge. The thing that happened when we did that, when we changed our model to what we know is more healthy, we actually had a pace of about 4,000 people a year coming through our doors. And, we're a larger ministry for this area. We went down to about 1,300 people a year. So we saw a lot less people coming through our door when we began to implement more accountability, more relationship, more challenge into what we were doing. The question is, where did they go? And that's when we realized, hey, we need to think about how to impact a community, and not even a community, but systems, that a lot of which have been birthed out of bad policy that deliver low-hanging fruit to people that really don't need the low-hanging fruit, that they could be challenged in some ways that would be better for them and the communities that they live in. And that was really the birth of the True Charity Initiative, looking at how can we help leaders, charities, communities do better and more effective charity work, and then even consider how that could be used to influence policy makers to rethink what they're doing and how they might be interfering with a more healthy process.
I don't want to get too far afield here, but my curiosity wants to know, how long did that process of sort of transitioning take, and how did you deal with, I can, depending on how you answer that first part, the second part might be, how did you deal with, I guess, turning people away? Or was it that, we don't do that any longer? I don't know what that looked like. I don't know if you can give us a sense of that transition period at all.
Well, the change in what we were doing was gradual. There were a number of different things that we did, but when we look at one thing, just the implementation of what we call our Earn It model, which was the development of a separate ministry called the Worth Shop. We call it a Worth Shop because we believe that work awakens worth in people's lives. And this is where people go to earn a meal ticket. They earn a night of shelter. They earn clothing or furniture, appliances, basically anything. If they're able to do something, then they'll go and earn that. And that's not to say there aren't times for relief when really it's a sub-zero night and someone doesn't have socks or shoes. I mean, there are times when you provide relief, but most people have the ability to earn something that they need, and it's very good. Well, to do that, when we had that ready to go, we went through a phase of about 2 to 3 months where we were notifying people and letting them know, hey, our model is changing. And so we really thought that it would be worse than what it was. Because it was such a significant change in the way that we were doing ministry, to go from a handout model to suddenly we're going to ask you to put in a little skin in the game for what you need today. We thought we might, empty out the ministry and not have anybody there at all, but that was not the case. But again, over time, we saw about half or more folks that ended up not being a part of what we were requiring. But we were, again, took a few months to make sure we were notifying people in a lot of ways that transition was coming. And the results have been fantastic. So just, it's such a more dignified way to approach charity work and really edifies people.
Yeah. When we think about the quote unquote issue of poverty, I've often reflected, and this could be true of any issue that we deal with that has become politicized. We treat it like an issue. We treat it like it's something we have to systematically, either from the government or from an organizational standpoint, sort of solve for or deal with or come up with a policy response to. And my guess is that you don't see this as an issue per se, but you see the human beings behind the issue that are actually dealing with it. I don't work directly in the kind of work that you do, so it's different for me. So I just want to get your kind of thoughts on that whole conundrum. For many people, it is an issue to solve rather than like, hey, there's people there.
Yeah, you can't do that. You can't say there's an issue to solve. I mean, I guess you can, but if you begin to develop solutions or, what you think are going to be solutions to an issue, you're going to miss actually bringing about the flourishing that God intends for the individual. So it really is an individual issue. It's just not it's not the issue of homelessness or the issue of addiction, or it's people. It's a person who's experiencing homelessness. And, we have 105 beds that we offer through our various programs here. And any one of those individuals that we could go to and have a conversation, it's going to be completely different than the person that he or she might be sleeping next to. Every person has a unique background and situation. And so this reminds me of something that Arthur Brooks wrote about one time in dealing with the difference between complicated and complex. I can't remember which book it was, but I love the way he puts this. He says, complicated is like building a jet engine. And that's a complicated problem. But once you've done it and you have like a blueprint for it, then you can just mass produce the same jet engine over and over again. You've solved the problem. But he says that's complicated. Complex is more like a football game. Every single one is different, and there's no way that you can determine the outcome of a football game because there's so many different variables at play. It's just impossible. It's complex. He says people and these people struggling in poverty with addiction, people struggling with homelessness, those are complex individuals with complex histories and complex issues that can never be solved through a socially engineered bureaucratic blueprint that would try to address a complicated problem. And that is what we see a lot of the times happening through policy right now.
That's a really good way to think about it. It's not complicated, it's complex. And that poses completely different sets of questions and problems to deal with.
It does. And it means that we're going to have to be relationally involved with individuals, which is what, this is what God tells us. The name of our rescue mission is Watered Gardens, coming out of Isaiah chapter 58, where God is promising his people that if we will choose the fast that he's chosen to help those in need, that will be like a watered garden and like a spring whose waters never fail. It's a beautiful passage. Yeah. But in Isaiah 58, verse 10, he says, if you extend yourself, some versions say, if you give your lives to those in need. And so there's an aspect of a very personalized, close relationship that has to happen between one individual and another when we're really helping a person. And we should never forget that.
What are some of the challenges that we face when we try to help those who are poor? Or I'm following this up with a question about we don't treat it like an issue, but what are some challenges that we tend to face when dealing with the problem of poverty with the people either around us or just generally?
Well, the problems, and I mean, I don't want to beat the drum too much here, but the problem that we are facing is really two different ideas about how to address poverty. I mean, the one that we've talked about here, where we're dealing with on an individual basis, where there's relationship and accountability, there's a greater understanding of what's really going on in the person's life. And then the other solution that is trying to create a complicated, looking at it as a complicated problem and creating some sort of a blueprint solution. And so, it's a means tested welfare program. If you fall within, 130% of poverty level or below, then you qualify for this particular voucher to do this, and it's going to solve the problem. And what we find is that for us, Doug, the greatest struggle is how much that interferes with what would be good and healthy and helping people step into the flourishing life God intends and the communities that they're involved in. And so you really do have an interference. in this principle, we teach through our True Charity Initiative, we teach a lot about subsidiarity and the idea that a person who needs help, we should first start with that individual and asking to respect that person's dignity and capacity. What can you do for yourself? But then what about your immediate family? Is there a brother, a sister, a mother, a father who can be involved? Are you connected to a church somewhere? Is there a church that could help? Is there a local mission maybe in the community that could help? We should exhaust all of that before we're looking at state-funded solutions or federally funded solutions. The problem is that the massive overreach of our federal government into the charity sector interrupts those natural ties, that natural subsidiarity that should exist. And it divides relationships or dissolves them and creates an unhealthy situation that was never intended to be. That's our biggest problem right now. And it's one of the reasons why we want to do a good job in our own model in Southwest Missouri, but we want to see more of that happening in other communities with other missions. And that's why we, have launched our True Charity Initiative.
Yeah. And I could see how it could also sort of act as a way of absolving people of responsibility by saying, oh, well, I'm just going to outsource this through taxation or, not feel as guilty about it because, I pay a lot in taxes and I know that goes toward charity work instead of, sort of calling people to responsibility to love their neighbor in a hands-on sort of way.
Right. It's easier. You just don't get your hands dirty. If there's a government that can just take a little bit out of my pocket and deal with the problem, and I go on about my way, then so be it. The problem is they're not dealing with it. And over the last 50 years, we've spent, $23 trillion on anti-poverty programs, but the poverty rates ranged from 11 to 15%, and it really hasn't changed much. So, and that's even with an ever increasing amount into these programs that are being paid out, to individuals. We're really, the more we do, it does not get any better. And so we should learn from that and realize there's a better way that we need to be helping the poor in our communities.
Yeah. Even if, let's just for the sake of hypothetical, even if the government programs were quote unquote working at reducing poverty, I don't know if that's even the most ideal way, because the measure isn't, well, are there fewer poor people? At an economic level, that'd be great. Okay, let's say there's only 0.5% of our population is really poor. But, if people aren't in community with one another, lifting each other up, if the rich and the poor aren't communing, if you will, to think of it even more intimately, if they're not communing with one another in fellowship, then did we really solve the social problem? Are we really truly being Christians in resolving basically the brokenness that we see? And I don't want to under or downplay the role in keeping people out of poverty, but even in a hypothetical situation, I think that we haven't actually achieved real social justice or real community and fellowship, even if the government were to able to economically quote unquote solve the problem.
Oh, I agree with you. And I think that you've said it perfectly. And I think it's a great reason why we should not argue solely on the basis of the government being ineffective. In other words, the fact that the government is ineffective in helping the poor should not be the primary argument as to why government should not be involved in helping the poor. So it's simply not a role of government. Government's never going to be able to do a good job with it. And you're right. It will not allow for the proper relationships to occur that need to occur, which is, brings me to just a thought on the church. The church is such a great platform for what we call bridging social capital. I think it might have been Robert Putnam who developed that term, but the idea of developing those ties and relationships that are outside of your own immediate circle of influence can be incredibly helpful for people who are struggling in poverty. It's a link to a new job or some new training that you didn't have access to, simply because you were able to meet somebody or shake hands with somebody that you didn't know because they're not inside your immediate circle.
Yeah.
Well, the church is such a great platform for that because we all have the same spiritual need. We all have the same need for a savior. We all need an eternal perspective. The gospel of Jesus Christ transcends socioeconomic divides. So what a great opportunity for those who are struggling with poverty to meet those who are not, within the church context. So, and you're right, the more the government's involved, the less that kind of thing is going to happen.
Yeah. Well, this kind of leads me to my next is the government being involved. In what ways does the state interfere with the kind of work that you're doing, or just broadly, even maybe not specifically your work, but you can share both?
Yeah, I mean, it is the creation of perverse incentives. And so we see that all the time in a variety of different ways. In fact, I mean, we have a long-term program called Forge. It's our Center for Virtue and Work. And it's a 12 to 15 month commitment that guys make to character development and work readiness. And part of the commitment is I'm not going to be dependent on the government for anything. I'm moving toward a path of self-reliance. And we just had, I think it was 2 days ago, one of our students who left the program. And in part of the reasoning that came about in our discussion with him, it had something to do with the stimulus check. So here's the indiscriminate redistribution of wealth. Actually, that's it'll have to be printed. I mean, it's not like we actually have that, but I mean, it's been just given out indiscriminately to people who might be struggling with addiction issues, who might be on a right path in a long-term program like ours. And it suddenly, the temptation derails them. And so we see that kind of thing all the time. I mean, even with, like housing first ideas, which is a HUD initiative, Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Mm-hmm.
And housing first is this idea, hey, let's just take a person and put them rapidly into a house if they're homeless. And so I have seen and can remember even a guy right now in my mind that I was sitting down having lunch with in our dining room, and I had not met him before. And I said, so are you recently homeless? And he was a young man, Doug. I think he was 19, 20 years old. Mm. I said, are you recently homeless? And he said, yeah. And I said, what's going on? You're here in shelter? And he said, yeah, I'm here in shelter at the mission. And I said, okay, well, what's going on? He said, well, I was living with my mother and my grandmother, but an agency in the community said that I might qualify for my own place if I was homeless for a short amount of time. So that's what I'm doing right now. So here we have housing, and even with the new act that just passed, the American Rescue Plan Act, we have $5 billion of emergency housing vouchers within that plan that are extended to 2030. And what that will do in communities, along with a lot of other housing initiative stuff that's a part of that plan, will create kind of a drive inside of the agency leaders to find how they can get those people to use those housing vouchers. And it will unintentionally create a perverse incentive for people to leave some situations and be homeless so they can qualify. Now, not everybody's going to do that. But the point is that without knowing the individual and the circumstances that are going on behind that person's case and their scenario, we can't do a good job.
Yeah. Well, as you and I both well know, that the government creates perverse incentives for even people who are not poor. So, of course, it's going to going to create those problems, on a broader society. Well, the other thing is the perverse incentives on the people who are willing to provide assistance and help. When I think it was when you raise I can't remember the name of it. It's the level of charity that you give on your taxes is like the general deduction or something like that. Mm-hmm. I think if you make that too high, then people are like, oh, well, it doesn't matter how much I give. I'm not going to be able to write it off. So, you have that incentive as well.
Sure.
standardized deduction. That's the word I'm looking for.
Well, when you were talking,
versus itemized.
when you were talking, it reminded me of kind of an unseen consequence. It's really crowd out, right? It's when the private sector is being crowded out by government involvement. But yeah, those who would have a tendency to give more or to do more end up being crowded out, and it's a really hard thing to measure because when you're crowded out, you're not there, so it's out of sight, out of mind. But one example was when our former state governor, who wasn't a governor for very long, Eric Greitens, he made a cut in prisoner entry funding. So prisoner reentry funding. So folks coming out of incarceration, needing some basics to get back to work, right? And so he cut $127 million out of the budget for prisoner reentry funding. And there was a lot of angst in our community about that. And I remember a group saying, hey, would you be willing to talk with some local legislators with us about the importance of keeping that? And I said, no. And they, of course, were shocked. And I said, listen, I really think that if that's gone, there'll be some other things that will come about as a result of the absence of that funding. And sure enough, when he cut that, we had one of our larger churches naturally step into that space and begin to provide some work boots and other things for folks coming out of prison to be able to help them get the jobs that they need. And so that was a perfect example because that church never felt crowded out. They didn't realize that they were being crowded out. But when the government had stepped out of the picture, the church stepped in. And that's got to be happening on a grand scale that we can't even imagine.
I didn't share with you my outline, but you keep leading me to my next questions very naturally. I actually, the next question I have for you is, do you know, and what are some of the statistics you know of on how Americans are they good at giving and volunteering? Are they bad? Has it gotten worse? What's the state of American individual initiatives toward relief organizations in poverty?
Yeah, I don't know the current right now, and I can see a graph in my head. I remember writing something, I think it was with the Heritage Foundation. They were looking at some of this stuff, and there was a decrease in volunteerism over the last, I want to say 10 to 15 years. It hasn't been sharp, but it's been pretty consistent. And so it seems like we have, less on that front that's been happening, but I don't have any numbers in mind right now, Doug. I just know that I think there have been less volunteers nationally in the larger picture.
Yeah,
we certainly have a lot of volunteers at work in our community, but it takes a lot of work to be out there and talking with a lot of folks and a lot of churches and making sure that we're providing that opportunity. But one of the things that we do, we don't take any government funding, and we also don't think about, well, let's hire for another position to get filled. We are always thinking about how can we see the church engaged on a volunteer level. And so because we've kind of confined ourselves within that scope, because it is our mission statement to serve the church and its mission to help the poor. That's the mission statement for Watered Gardens Ministries. So we've confined ourselves in some ways that demand that we are out there talking with folks who could potentially be in our mission, filling positions as a volunteer. And again, the more that you're put in a place where that's the demand, I think the better that you'll do. But the more that there are other ways to accomplish things, I think the more we'll see a decline in things like volunteerism.
Do you know how the pandemic has affected, your organization? I'm sure you can talk about that, but just do you know anything beyond that? Like, how has it affected the type of thing that you're doing?
Sure. I mean, I think that the stat that we have is pretty common among missions within our network, which is a national network of missions that we're a part of. And I'm speaking about Watered Gardens right now, not True Charity, but 46% attrition is what we experienced, pretty immediately in volunteerism. And that has almost fully returned now, but not quite back to full scope. So yeah, it was certainly, a very sharp hit initially. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that many volunteers are retired. And so you're in that age bracket where you're not maybe quite as safe and might be a little more immune compromised for some reason or another.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that was pretty typical from what I heard on some calls nationally with other missions. That was pretty typical.
Yeah. What about the Equality Act? I think you mentioned it, but how is that going to affect things going forward?
The Equality Act is potentially very, very harmful to the poor. If it passes, there's a very good chance that you will see some very healthy, good mission operations around the country close their doors, I'm afraid. And I really believe that because I know a lot of leaders that are much like me, very committed but very convicted about God's word. And so if suddenly our hands are being tied by the government and who we can hire, or even our hiring practices, or if we're not able to discriminate on, biological gender to determine where you're going to sleep in our shelter facility for the night, I think you'll see a lot of organizations that'll say, I can no longer do this with a clear conscience. And the Bible is very clear that we're not to be a people who compromise when it comes to what we're convicted about. So the Equality Act could be really, really difficult. And for, the listeners, I don't, we haven't defined what the Equality Act is, but it is really an alteration of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that would include, my understanding is, LGBTQ right alongside race and gender that are mentioned, at the end of almost every line of the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of that, it would potentially interfere even with privately funded religious nonprofits in their hiring practices and their facilities and their accommodations for people. And that's going to be a really tough thing when you move into the Christian and faith-filled sector.
Mm-hmm.
And so my hope is, Doug, that if the Equality Act passes, that there will be some nonprofit that will, challenge that. If there's a lawsuit, take it to the Supreme Court. And I would only hope and pray that the Supreme Court would uphold that nonprofit's defense based on First Amendment freedom to exercise religion right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that we talked about perverse incentives. We talked about, there's a number of ways in which the state really sort of messes things up. And this is one that isn't really directly related to poverty legislation. It's something altogether a different approach, different thought process, different policy aims and goals, but it could really affect things.
Oh, yeah. And that the legislators that are, voting probably opposed or not, probably are not thinking about the impact necessarily that this could have on private charities that are doing good
Mm-hmm.
work to help the poor.
Yeah. So a lot of our listeners might be thinking, hey, I need to learn more. I need to know more. This is an area that I need to improve on how I work with people. Maybe they're already doing charity work. Maybe they want to. And so you actually have a summit coming up in May 2021. And I'd like to give you a chance to kind of share what that's going to be about, who's going to be there. I believe you told me it was in person, so you don't have to do it remotely, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we would.
So go ahead and tell our audience about what you're up to there.
Sure, yeah. It's called the True Charity Summit. It's an annual conference. This will be a day and a half, and it's at Missouri Southern State University in Joplin, Missouri. The title of this summit, we're calling it Reclaiming Justice. The reason why is because the word justice is thrown around so much today. There are cries for justice, but rarely are people thinking about, what does that really mean? And are we misusing this term that's really a virtue, justice? And, where did this come from? And so we're excited to share a lot of information about justice at this conference. And we think it is something that we should reclaim, that it seems like the far left is doing a lot in the idea of social justice. But what does that mean, right? I think it was Hayek who was at a conference in Australia, and he began his presentation on, I think it was on justice, and he said, for the last 10 years, I've been researching social justice, and I still don't know what that means. And so the idea of social justice, what is that? So we want to look at it from some different perspectives, like what is economic justice? We'll have Ann Bradley will be here to do a series of lectures on economic justice. We'll have Dr. Patrick Gary, and he'll do historical justice. So he'll have a whole, a track on historical justice that he'll deliver. Scott Allen will do the social justice, but it's really all about biblical justice. And so he'll do that track, and I'll do a track on practical justice. What does that look like when we're really employing these things that we're learning about on the ground? The keynote speaker is Lawrence Reed, Larry Reed, formerly and the president of the Foundation for Economic Education, and just a fantastic lecturer. If you've ever heard Larry Reed, you know that. And his first opening lecture on the base camp day, which will be May 18th, was Jesus a Socialist? So that'll be his first lecture that he'll do, and that's
amazing. It'll be really, really short. I mean, it's just one word, right? No.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of people who think yes. And so he's going to spend a little bit of time unpacking that for us and learning why Jesus was not a socialist.
Yeah.
But so May 18th and 19th, your listeners can go to truecharity.us and learn about the summit under the events tab. Sign up there. And there will be a way to do a streaming, but of course it'll be limited in the streaming. It'll just be one day, and it'll be a particular set of classes. So we much rather have people to come. They can choose their own tracks they want to be involved with, and be there in person for both days.
Excellent. Well, I wish you well on that. I know a lot of people are really itching to do in-person events, so I hope your turnout is going to do well. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah, right. Hopefully we hit the timing just right where it'll be like everybody will want to be involved personally, but we do have an online option as well.
Yeah, cool. Well, James, I really appreciate you coming on and talking about this. I have a hunch this won't be the last time we have a conversation, so thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Doug. Love what you guys are doing and appreciate you so much. And thanks for the time today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast. If you liked today's episode, we encourage you to rate us on Apple Podcasts to help expand our audience. If you want to reach out to us, email us at podcast@libertarianchristians.com. You can also reach us at LCI Official on Twitter. And of course, we are on Facebook and have an active group you are welcome to join. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Libertarian Christian Podcast is a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute, a registered 501c3 nonprofit. If you'd like to find out more about LCI, visit us on the web at libertarianchristians.com. The voiceovers are by Matt Bellis and Catherine Williams. As of episode 115, our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.